to session 3, which is called Model for Enabling Employment Guidance, Toolkits and Progression Metrics. It's a delight to have you all with us this afternoon. It's Friday, it's Zoom, so we do appreciate that attendance at some of these webinars and conferences can be exhausting. So we are going to keep the time from now until 3:15. There probably won't be any spaces for dialogue, which is unfortunate, but it is one of the challenges of this kind of format. Before I introduce the speakers, I do want to acknowledge that these are uncertain and challenging times. And not only because of COVID, but also for many of you who are present and listening to this seminar, there are huge transitions going on in employment services. These are uncertain times. Some services don't know what's happening to their jobs. It can leave us all very anxious. And even more importantly, there is need to take time to think, to focus on what we're doing, and to create space for reflecting on practice. So this is a very timely seminar. The other thing I'd like to say to you, and I'm not sure if you can hear me, so apologies if there's problems with my audio. The next thing, or the only thing I would like to say is after each input, we're just going to take a minute for you to jot down one thing that stays with you from the presentation. And it creates a bridge from that session to the next session, because these are very valuable inputs and it can be hard to remember what each person is saying. So the first person I would like to introduce you to is Deirdre Hughes, who is going to talk about contextualizing employment guidance. Deirdre is a freelance academic researcher, career development professional, and government policy advisor. She has written over 125 articles in book chapters and made over 200 presentations to international, national, and regional professional groups dealing with all age careers work, employment, and skills issues. She is a CEDAFOP appointed national expert in lifelong guidance and careers education in May 2017. And she was awarded an OBE in the 2012 Queen's Birthday Honours List for service to career guidance. Very honoured to have you here this afternoon, Deirdre, and we look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Mary, for that very warm introduction. I will just share my screen here. Hopefully you can see my slides. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending where you are in the world. I'd like to begin really by thanking everyone who's joined this afternoon's session, and also to congratulate the Maynooth University team for a really, really stimulating morning of presentations. So I'm Deirdre. I've got 10 to 15 minutes max to share some ideas really on this theme, very much around enabling employment guidance, research perspectives and activation in Ireland. But for hopefully some of the things I'll have to say will resonate wherever you are in the world. What I thought I would do is I would focus really on 4 key things in the short time that I have with you. As Mary said, when people ask about my career, I say, think of me as a triangle. At the top, there's policy, and each side there's research and indeed practice. And I think today's afternoon session will really hopefully touch on all aspects of not just research, but practice and how we can actually improve things going forward. So I'm going to look at the aftermath of COVID on the theme of reimagining, which is what we've heard a lot about this morning. I want to talk about the changing ecosystem in employment guidance and career counselling, and really lifelong guidance systems that we see across the world in many different forms. And then I want to touch on decent work and inclusion, and finish really with a challenge for each and every one of us around how do we ensure in these volatile, uncertain times where there's so much ambiguity, not just for us in our current roles, but for the clients that we serve, how we can actually drive up the quality of provision so that the person-centered services that we hold close to our hearts are relevant for modern times. So many people will be familiar with these words on the screen, the aftermath of COVID. Only today, we've heard on lunchtime news that Debenhams, our large departmental chain, our high streets, 12,000 workers have lost their jobs. And so, you know, the world of not just the world that we inhabit here, remote working from Exeter in England, but also our high streets and our communities are changing rapidly. So today's conference is very, very timely. So new skill needs, changing technologies, the impact of automation and artificial intelligence, unclear pathways, and the evolution of local labour markets. And three key aspects, I think, for us to think about in the context of enabling employment guidance is to think about the move to skills and what skills activation means in today's society. Also to think about places and spaces, and I'm going to give you a wicket question, which I hope when it comes up in my presentation, you'll be able to actually answer, or indeed it will perhaps get you thinking. And thirdly, I think that regardless of what we hear around disruptive technology, that we also will have humans in the loop, regardless of how things unfold in our digital world going forward. And I want to say a little bit about that in the context of the ecosystem for employment guidance and career counselling. So all of us are trying to find new solutions in this period of uncertainty. And I guess if there was a minister here in our audience, I would say that most ministers are given oversight of this area of public employment service or career guidance and counselling. And many face a very steep learning curve when it comes to getting to grip with both sectors. And usually just as they begin to understand, they get moved sideways or upwards. So actually pressure is there for all of us, ministers included, around how best they can formulate policy that will actually work at the grassroots level. And I want to draw on recent experience I've had in Wales, looking at the design of a vision for what's called Brighter Futures 2021 to 2026. I also want to draw on some research that I'm currently involved in with the Department for Economy in Northern Ireland, looking at future scenarios, particularly for the tech industry. And I'm chair of the UK Matrix Quality Standard, which is really all about looking at how can we improve information, advice and guidance in a whole range of different community settings. And the last time actually I travelled was over to Donegal, where I worked with colleagues in the adult education sector. So I have very, very fond memories of that. So pressure is something that can actually feel intense, but it can work for us if what we can find are those sweet spots, just finding the right tools to be able to activate not just the people that we serve, but find our own energy and our own expertise that can be put to really good effect. So this morning we heard a lot about unemployment, we heard a lot about activation, and I wanted to begin very briefly with the story of Tentative Terry. And this is a case study where I've been working on the design of an AI-powered chatbot for information and advice. This is in the UK. And from that, we've interviewed lots and lots of people to actually look at the reality of their situation. And I want to just very briefly introduce tentative Terry, who's nervous and who basically is 29. And on the face of it, for Terry, in a customer service job with a qualification at what we'd call level 2, his life, might seem fairly straightforward. But when you look at Terry's circumstances, he lives with his girlfriend, he's got an 18-month-old child. He doesn't have a strong track record of feeling confident. And his circumstances are such during the pandemic that there's no choice but to change job. And in the case of Terry, he presents as though he'll take any job in the short term. Now, if we actually look at what his needs are and we look at his feelings, we can see that the motivations to change are both intrinsic and extrinsic. But actually, when we look at Terry's situation, his situation is quite complex. Other life events include a health condition, moving house, splitting up with his partner. Now, I wanted to just introduce Terry to you at the beginning to sort of remind perhaps all of us that there will be stories of clients whose circumstances are quite complex. And I think this is one of the challenges for public employment services around the world, and indeed for careers professionals, is how best to actually serve individuals for whom life is not necessarily straightforward. And a simple system of give some information to Terry or give him a bit of advice is not necessarily going to help Terry actually turn his life around. And I'll come back to Terry at the end. Now, I think one of the key things really here is that society is changing in such a way that we have what are called sticky floors and sticky ceilings. The OECD report recently highlighted the broken social elevator. And I think the discussion that we're having around trying to find tools and ways of bringing communities of professionals together is really, really essential. Not least because we know from research that often, and the OECD research shows this, that young men whose fathers are CEOs or indeed mothers are CEOs are often those that will end up in professional and managerial positions. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, we have the sticky floors whereby individuals in today's society are actually feeling unable and ill-equipped and under-supported in being able to actually make really good decisions that will improve their social mobility. Now, I think one of the key things when I sort of look across work that I have done with CEDAFOP and indeed with other organisations that actually bring PES and the careers counsellors together is that what unites us is that we are informing and we are supporting transitions in many different ways. And it's best described that what we've got is an ecosystem of PES and careers counsellors who in many respects, in some cases are quite separate, in other cases are very, very much intertwined in service design and delivery. And I think Ireland is going through this critical phase now of actually looking at, in the aftermath of the pandemic, how can individuals, both within the workforce and outside of the workforce, how can they actually be made to feel that there is opportunity for them and that their talents can best be used. And I referred to Mary's comment earlier. But in essence, PES and careers organisations are really looking at this theme of transitions. And I think that's a key point I would like to make in my presentation around looking ahead. how can we support transitions where we have more and more people underskilled, overskilled, overqualified, skills gaps, and the notion of reimagining the services, I think, is a really, really important key point. And at the beginning of this morning's presentation, there was knowledge mobilization as a concept. And I'd actually like to build on that concept of knowledge mobilization. For each and every one of us, inclusion is ultimately about the dignity and the worth of every person. And it does require societies to celebrate diversity, to address the deep-seated inequalities and exclusion that persist. So my first question to you really is, how will you create a safety net with places and spaces for individuals to find high quality employment, careers support? And lifelong learning, we can see in the policy development, while we've been talking about it for years, the realization now is that lifelong learning has become a reality. Only earlier this week in the UK, in our Queen's speech, government have indicated that they will provide a lifetime skills guarantee. But one of the missing elements in the lifetime skills guarantee is actually the support network in local places and spaces that will enable individuals to actually take up that lifetime skills guarantee. And so with that in mind, I want to present this idea of leaderhood in employment and careers counselling and guidance within the ecosystem that each of us work in. First of all, there is no single organisation or profession who can address the full-scale negative impact of unemployment. Collaboration, cooperation, coordination, co-creation, communication will be essential. And I've put hashtag Working Wales. This is an initiative where public employment services in Wales, along with the National Career Service, have been working together in all of these collaboration, cooperation, to actually ensure that there is a profile and that there are specialisms that can actually, specialist workers who can support individuals in their local places and their local spaces. I think we need to also be reminded of the new poor forced into poverty by COVID. The World Bank report has reminded us that the people using public employment services now are not primarily the low skilled and the low qualified. So again, we've got to reimagine what those services will look like. And I think the work first and the life first continuum is a really important framework for us to ask the wicked question: where are the local places and spaces for citizens to go to for learning and support? And blended lifelong guidance is actually on the increase. And I think we need to look at that around the uptake of support at a local level.
Deirdre, you have a minute left.
Yes, I'm just going to finish on a couple of 1 minute, just to say that decent work, inclusion and sustainability, we have a British Journal for Guidance and Counselling special issue that's coming out. Really, I think what I'd like to just emphasize here is that we are in this changing world of work with a hybrid remote work likely to continue, the growth in e-commerce and delivery economy and AI and machine learning. So we need a cultural map of aspirations and for the evidence base to start early. And that does require that duality of peers and career counsellors actually working together. We need a quality-driven employment and careers guidance system where we can test and learn and innovate, and professionalisation of the workforce. Now, back in 2015 in Ireland, there was a national policy group for lifelong guidance recommendation presented to ministers. I really do hope that moving forward, that policy group can form so that we can get that leaderhood of ideas that support transitions. Just finish really on this note of how do we reimagine leadership management, and really it's about looking at the quality of service design and delivery and perhaps to look at these sort of tight controls of rational quality and the loose controls of culture and values. The triage system, I think, with specialist support is needed, has to be improved. And the rediscovering of place and space for the professionals in PES and in the careers community to think and solve problems with each other. And I just really want to finish, I know that the respondents will pick up on this, around we need to redefine the standards in a digital age where inclusion and well-being are actually at the core. So finish with tentative Terry. I want tentative Terry in Ireland to know that he can become tenacious Terry and that he can find the sort of support that he needs. Thank you for your time. I just want to say that in other countries, we've got very strong evidence on PES and career counsellors working together. And I know that in Ireland that you actually will be able to do that. And there is plenty of evidence that can support you in that. So leaderhood and thinking from the grassroots up, as well as leadership from the ministers in terms of a national centre of excellence or forum would be my strong recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre, for a very inspiring and hopeful presentation in a time when, as you say, there's lots of anxieties. We are in transitions, but while there's crises, you also say to us, this is a period for opportunities. Thank you. Could I ask everybody who's listening, we have nearly 130 people, just to take a pen for a moment and write 2 sentences on what struck you or stays with you from Deirdre's presentation, and maybe of help in your own practice. It's a quick minute, so if you could be finishing what you were going to write, just to capture what stayed with you from Deirdre's. I'd like to introduce you to the next speaker, who is, many of you know and familiar with, Nuala Whelan. And Nuala is going to speak on the model of engaging employment guidance, toolkits and metrics. And just to remind you who Nuala is, Nuala is a work and organizational psychologist and postdoctoral researcher on the IRC Burlesque project, a collaborative approach to building a public employment service. Based in Maynooth University Social Science Institute and the Department of Sociology. With 20 years practitioner experience in Ballymun Job Centre, Nuala's main research interest lies in effective employment guidance services, labour market policy and activation, long-term and youth unemployment, policy practice gaps, which we're all familiar with, interagency working, innovative design, assessment design, and of course, coaching and wellbeing at work. I look forward to Nuala's presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Mary, for that very nice introduction, and thank you, Deirdre, for your very inspiring talk. So I'm just going to share my screen here, and okay. Now, hopefully you can see that okay. So I'm going to talk about our model of enabling employment guidance that myself and my colleague, Mary Murphy, and Michael McGann have been working on over the past nearly 2 years now. So I hope that you find it engaging. So just first of all, I thought it would be important to maybe just briefly mention the Leave No One Behind challenges. So we started this work 2 years ago with the idea of leaving no one behind. And now we're, I suppose, coming hopefully towards the end of a pandemic. And that question is maybe even more important. I'm then going to just look a little bit about defining what employment guidance is, and then briefly to talk about our contribution to this area, which is really focusing on, I suppose, the conceptualization of employment guidance within labour market policy, a toolkit that we've developed for practitioners working in this area, and then a measurement tool that will try and, I suppose, hopefully help us measure some of the things that Colin Lindsay mentioned earlier, the important positive outcomes from job centres and public employment services that we all know as practitioners exist, but find it very difficult to show any evidence for. So to focus a little bit in on that. So in terms of the Leave No One Behind challenges, I thought it was important to maybe just talk about the unemployment rate. So what are we kind of dealing with at the minute? And our unemployment rate in April 2021 was 5.8%. But when we add in people who are in receipt of the pandemic unemployment payment, that shoots up to 22.4%. So these are claimants of the pandemic unemployment payment that if their jobs don't reappear, they will be classified as unemployed. And when we look at the 15 to 24-year-old age group, that's maybe a much worse picture. So the standard rate is 15.9%, but when we add in the PUP payment claimants, that shoots up to 60%, just over 60%. So a space that we're all working in at the moment and thinking about, I suppose, this context. And I've just a little diagram there of the kind of key organizations working in this space, but also there are lots of various services that are also supporting people who are going through the public employment service and are, referred in and out and so on. And just some of the challenges that I thought were important to mention that, the previous risks continue to exist. So the previous risks that were there prior to COVID are still there, but they've been added to maybe, and a lot of things have been accelerated as a result of the pandemic. So we're now, as Deirdre said, in uncertain futures. There's a lot of advancements rapidly occurring across many sectors of work. New work environment. So many of us have seen this huge acceleration into remote and digital working. So maybe creating a much bigger gap between some of us that can work in that way and people who maybe can't work in that way. Permanent closures, as Deirdre also mentioned, about Debenhams and maybe the need for reduced staff going forward. And yet many of the people that engage with the public employment services are really faced with kind of multiple challenges in terms of accessing work. So from skills to more personal issues of maybe mental health or addiction to poor employment history, youth, and so on. So a whole range of challenges that face people who are engaging in our services. And then the emphasis on job placement. So our current model is very much focused on job placement, and the ratio between administration and guidance provision in our services. Recently, a practitioner told me that it was 80-20, 80% of her time spent on administration and only 20% on guidance. So we're grappling with that as practitioners as well. And then our service delivery has changed to a more hybrid model, and it's very likely that that will continue into the future. And the time, of course, then that we have to work with clients. So all of those challenges facing people using the services, people designing the services, and people working in the services. So in terms of our presentation today, I thought it was important to mention employment, define employment guidance, and maybe firstly to define guidance more broadly. And this definition of guidance comes from the National Forum, the National Guidance Forum in Ireland in 2007. And they decided to define guidance as something that facilitates people throughout their lives to manage their own educational, training, occupational, personal, social and life choices so that they reach their full potential and that they can contribute to the development of a better society. So a very all-inclusive definition of guidance. So when we talk about employment guidance, what do we mean? And employment guidance is really a specific form of that broader guidance definition that aims to build people's employability. So that is their ability to gain and maintain a job in a formal work environment and to become self-sufficient in the labour market. It involves a combination of factors that enable people to progress towards, transition into and sustain employment and to progress their careers. And Colin Lindsay earlier spoke about those kind of, what are the kind of factors that, enable employability. So we know there are personal attributes. These are the skills and knowledge that people come to the labour market with and how they're presented on the labour market, but also their personal circumstances, their health, their well-being, their own lives in many cases. The environmental and social context within which people operate and within their relationship with the labour market. So this is the opportunities maybe afforded to people to develop and validate those skills and knowledge that they have and to use that then on the labour market. The structural issues such as care, housing is a big one at the minute in Ireland, transport, and of course then the whole social organisation of work, which, as we know, we can really see before our very eyes at the minute, changing. So the casualisation of work, the gig economy, the precariousness of work, short-term contracts, and so on. And then, of course, our economic context, the types of jobs that are available on the labour market and how many of those jobs are available. So employment guidance is really situating itself within that context. And within our project, the ACAPES project, what we've been very focused on is the relationship between employment guidance and labour market policy, because of course they're very connected. And what we tried to do was to look at a continuum of labour market policy options. So you can see those on the screen. So from the work first activation model, which most of us will be very familiar with, where we're trying to very quickly, rapidly move people back into work, through to the human capital development model, which is more about developing skills and upskilling for the labour market, and this kind of continuum of upskilling for all workers, to the flourishing work-life balance model, which is more about a holistic approach to seeing our work and our life coordinated together, and that work should be well-being inducing in itself. Right through to a life first, which is very much about focusing on our lives. And I think Deirdre mentioned it and Mary mentioned it earlier about work forming part of our life, but the many other issues that are within our lives, and work might be just one of those issues. So these types of different options that we have in terms of supporting people back into work. And down the side there, you can see the various dimensions that researchers have looked at in the past. So Colin Lindsay, Hartley Dean, Lucy, all of these researchers have looked at these various types of labour market policy options and their dimensions in terms of their rationale, their relationship to the labour market, their conceptualization of the individual, the institutions that are involved, the time that's involved in their delivery, and so on. And we've tried to contribute to that in terms of maybe defining out the missing middle of implementation. So what did each of these look like in terms of their implementation, and the role and context or extent of employment guidance within each one of these. So you can see there, I've tried to put it underneath each of the models. So you can see that employment guidance in the work first activation policy is quite limited, and the focus really is on job matching. In the human capital development model, employment guidance focuses on education and training, but it's really very much focused on those who need it, or targeted at those who need it. And it's driven by an understanding of the person, of the self, whereas the flourishing life, work-life balance model is more holistic. It's driven by an understanding of the self and their context, and it leads really to sustainable employability across the lifespan. And then the Life First, again, a very holistic understanding of guidance driven by the self, the context, and also the transforming context, which is something that Deirdre mentioned earlier, that our lives are transforming, and that I think we've really seen that throughout the pandemic, the importance of work and our lives and how they fit together. And each one of these leads to a different type of employability. So from very functional type of employability right through to an empowering employability. And our focus in this project has been really on the work-life balance model, as we see it as a kind of maybe more practical position to take in terms of this conceptualization. So as a result, what we've developed is on the right-hand side there, you can see the work-life model, which really talks about holistic support, tailored person-centered approaches, co-produced services based on robust triage. So really understanding what the needs of the individual are, a professional employment guidance service and practitioners who are trained and experienced in using their methods and approaches. And of course, all operating in an interagency approach, often locally based, so that the person can access all of the services that they need in order to help them on their journey towards employment. And as we've developed a toolkit for practitioners, a metric, and then a practice poster, which we felt would be useful to practitioners to have on their wall to help them think through all of the options when they're working with clients. So I just have some screenshots here to show you the toolkit, just some elements of it, and the different sections within the toolkit. So we try to define employment guidance, and we also talk about the theoretical background, as I've just mentioned, in the toolkit. But then section 4 is, I suppose, we've really tried to focus in on the implementation of employment guidance. So that section might be of most interest to practitioners, and we've tried to detail that out a little bit, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Section 5 is on implementation and environment, and that section might be of most interest to managers of services, or if you're setting up a new service, what are the kind of key things that we should consider? And Deirdre mentioned one of them, the places and spaces. You know, where does guidance take place? What do we need to, what does that environment need to look like to enable a really effective employment guidance for our clients? And then section 6 focuses in on the metric and how to evaluate the work that you're doing. And I suppose this is a starting point for this work. So we hope that it's starting a conversation and a discussion that this is the type of toolkit that can be added to, that we'd like to build the evidence base, build the best practice, and incorporate best practice that practitioners are using around the country. And it'll be available in downloadable PDFs, and I'll come to that in a moment, but just to show you that while you mightn't be so interested maybe in the detail of implementing a guidance service, maybe you're more interested in defining it or downloading those particular aspects. So we've tried to divide up the toolkit into easily accessible chunks so that you're not maybe working your way through 100 pages to find the piece that you're interested in. Okay, so I thought maybe it would be useful then just to mention, because I know many of you tuned in today are practitioners, that section 4, as I said, is very much focused on practitioners. And we've tried to define, I suppose the stages of the guidance process. What does that look like? And within that, we've tried to suggest the number of meetings that will be useful at this point, the aims of each of the stage, the recommended resources and materials that the practitioner maybe should have to hand when they're, implementing that stage, the type of approach that might be useful to use, and some helpful tips to enable the implementation. So they're worksheets and various tools and approaches that practitioners that we've spoken to over the last 2 years have given us their tips and the worksheets and so on that they use.
Nuala, you have a minute.
Okay, I'll go really quickly. So this is I suppose an image of the type of practice poster that we hope to have. So you can see the person in the center there and the 6 stages working its way around, wrapping themselves around the person. So the 6 stages in the guidance process. And then on the outside, words like create, listen, explore, enable, support, maintain, that will help the practitioner to work with the client in a more collaborative way. And also to think about the specialist services, the interagency approach, referrals, employers, and so on, that will also maybe come in at the different stages of the guidance process. As I said, section 5 then is very much about implementation. So talking about the principles of employment guidance, what principles should guide the delivery of an employment guidance service, guidance setting, community of practice, the ethics in employment guidance practice, locally based services, and leadership or leaderhood, as I'm going to start talking about now as a result of Deirdre's presentation. So thinking about all of these important elements of implementing a guidance, an employment guidance service. And finally, just to look at the measurement tools. So unfortunately with COVID, we haven't managed to pilot the tool, but hopefully over the coming weeks, when in-person services start up again, we'll be able to do this. The measurement tool tries to focus on the personal attributes, the attitudinal factors, the structural factors, and future employability, that each of our clients, I suppose that there are positives that come from the employment guidance process, and to try and help the client, the practitioner, and the services to understand better what are the positive outcomes, what are the sub-steps, and how can we measure them. So we're hoping in the coming weeks to pilot the tool with about 400 people going through the services to try and get good levels of reliability and validity. So that's really important, that we can say that the tool is a robust tool that we can rely on to give us this information. Where to find these resources? So our partners, the INOU and the ILDN, have agreed to host the toolkit and the various pieces of information on their websites, but updates will be available on our own website, Activation in Ireland, going forward. And we'll put all of this information up on our conference website so that you can download the various resources. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuala. That was some achievement to try and synopsize very comprehensive, interesting, and innovative toolkit. I've seen it. I would suggest to, if you're a practitioner starting out or very experienced, you will find it of great help. Just to be reminded of the importance of creating spaces, potential transformation. Thank you, Nuala. Can I ask everybody to take again a minute before we go into the next presentation, and just to note what stayed with you from Nuala's presentation that you can relate to? A question, a comment, just something that really stayed with you, even if it's the shockingly high unemployment figures for young adults. What stayed with you from her presentation? And it's a quick minute. So if you could be just finishing what you're going to write, and we'll move on to the next presentation with Ciaran Reid. So Ciaran is going to, hi Ciaran. Ciaran is going to talk to us about usability, dissemination, and standards. The key issues in the whole of guidance centres, because how things are measured is how they're valued and how they're funded. So Ciaran has worked in local and community development over the last 27 years. He is currently the Chief Executive of Louth Partnership, which is a local development company which provides a range of employment, community and rural development programs. He's a board member of PUBL, and is active in identifying and promoting good practice in the local and community development sector. Thank you, Ciaran.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you can hear me okay. I'm very welcome the opportunity to be able to speak to today, and I think it recognises the important role that local development companies and local employment services have played over the last 30 years in implementing supports to unemployed people through the public employment service. And the local development companies and local employment services offer integrated and community-based supports to job seekers, particularly those most distant from the labour market. And we welcome the return to a focus on the supporting of the most disadvantaged job seekers in the proposed redesign of the employment services. From today's perspective, what I wanted to try and focus on is how do we effectively work to situate this new toolkit within practice, within local development and companies and the local employment service in particular. And in that context, what are the benefits of the tool in terms of guiding practice? So I wanted to have a look at this from a number of different perspectives. Firstly, from the manager, the organisation. Secondly, from the guidance practitioner, the job seeker. And then I suppose in terms of how is it situated in the context of the wider guidance context within the public employment service system. So in terms of the manager and the organisation, the toolkit provides an excellent opportunity to benchmark practice. Historically, local employment services and the local development companies have been providing services, and what we note there from Michael's comments this morning in terms of his feedback is that the clear differential between the practice in our sector, in the community and voluntary sector, is the experience of the staff that we have and the qualifications and the background under which they come from. And a lot of our staff would have a qualification in adult guidance, or certainly an experience of delivering adult guidance. So what this toolkit does for the manager, I suppose, is to help assist the induction of new clients, of new guidance workers, and setting standards, supporting supervision in relation to the implementation of the toolkit, and also then moving away from, or certainly looking to see, well, what's the difference between the probability of exit system, where we receive individual from the Department of Social Protection, through to then the adult guidance process. And this toolkit provides a clear pathway in relation to the practice. From the perspective of the guidance counsellor, and I'm looking for this in the wider setting, so it's not just mediators, it's potentially individuals then that work under the Social Inclusion and Community Activation Programme, CICAP, TUS, the Jobs Club practitioners. This toolkit should be available to all those individuals that effectively are meeting unemployed individuals. And what can the toolkit do for them? What it does, it supports practice, it helps reflect and have a reflective learning environment in relation to how practice is supported and guided. It provides opportunities for individuals to work together and to collaborate in terms of understanding the importance of a systemized process in the context of delivering services. And it provides a reassurance in terms of a quality reassurance that, well, I know what I'm doing, I know the importance of the practice because I'm following a clearly defined process in terms of the implementation. Then in terms of the job seeker, and I think that obviously this is the most important person in the equation, is what benefit will the toolkit have to the individual unemployed job seeker? And I'm mindful what we have already is that we have, say, in the CICAP initiative, is that we have the development of the My Journey Distance Travelled tool. And that's received widespread support in terms of being able to assist individuals take an assessment of where they are right now, And then after a pathway has been discussed, where they might be then in a number of months' time after a number of interventions. And this parallels that. Nuala described it in terms of a measurement tool. And in that context, what it will do is that it will provide an opportunity for individuals to be able to reflect, well, I've met a guidance counsellor now for a number of different sessions. I'm 6 months into it. Where would I like to be in 6 months' time? And in that context, it provides a very good opportunity for the individual to be able to sit back and measure their journey, and also then for the guidance practitioner to help work to support interventions to enable that journey to continue. Also, what it does, I suppose, it builds confidence, hopefully within the individual job seeker. Referencing the tentative person there in terms of the last presentation. So in that context, I think it's really important that the toolkit is a visible, is recognized by the individual job seeker in terms of the benefits to them, in terms of the individual being able to have a learning process from it. And ultimately, it's about making the right decision. So while we've talked about the job first model, what local development companies, in terms of the integrated approach that we'd like to take, is that we recognize, particularly from those that are most distant, is that journey takes time. And what this tool does is recognize the importance of defining and setting out the journey in collaboration then with the job seeker, and in that context provides a really solid and quality assurance process in terms of supporting the individual's journey. So outside that, I think the importance of the toolkit is that it's very much complementary to existing practice. We would hope that with our colleagues within the INOU and also the Irish Local Development Network, that we would take this tool and effectively champion it within the networks of the 49 local development companies and the LESs, that we would work with the mediator forum, the practice forum that's there within the Irish Local Development Network, to make sure that the opportunity for the toolkit is seen. Is there an opportunity then for wider dissemination within the totality of the work that we do, and ultimately situating it in the context of a unique selling point that we can have in terms of underpinning our practice, ensuring that it's quality driven, and ensuring then that we're able to provide the quality supports that job seekers need within the context of their job seeking. So just again, I'd like to very much thank the team within Maynooth. We've been part of an advisory committee with the ILOU and others, and we very much would like to see the toolkit being very much disseminated and used across all our networks. Thank you.
Ciaran, thank you very much for such a supportive. Sorry, Ciaran.
Yep.
IT, thank you very much for such a supportive and endorsing response to the toolkit. It's really helpful that anything that originates within academia is also connected with practice. So again, if we could just take a minute and just have a sense of what stayed with you from Ciaran's presentation. Now, if you finish that, I'd like to introduce you to Mary Stokes. Unfortunately, there isn't going to be space from a response from the floor, but we've asked two people to give a response to the three very rich presentations this afternoon. So Mary has been the Guidance Programme Coordinator for Further Education and Training at the National Centre for Guidance and Education since October 2016. NCGE is an agency of the Department of Education and Skills with responsibility to support and develop guiding practice in all areas of education. and to inform the policy of the department in the field of guidance. Mary has worked for over 25 years in a wide range of guidance counselling roles, including post-primary guidance counsellor, PLC, and community guidance counsellor, adult education counsellor, and an AEGS guidance counsellor coordinator. Thank you very much, Mary. And Mary is under intense pressure because we're only going to give the respondents a measly 7 minutes. Thank you, Mary. Mary, you're muted.
Hopefully I am no longer muted.
All well.
Good. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you very much to MUSSI, to Nuala, to all of the team and the wonderful work that's going on. I think that it is the concern of everyone engaging with guidance and engaging with individuals, with people, that we try to support everyone and that we make sure that people are not left behind. So I want, first of all, just to flash through a few slides that really are just to give you a sense of the National Centre for Guidance in Education and the work that we do. So there's quite a significant layer of work. And I do want to also focus, for example, on the ongoing developments in guidance on the lifelong, in the lifelong context, because I think that we may be looking at, for example, public employment services today, and yet it is important to engage developments so that we don't presume that what exists today will be the same tomorrow. As we know, everything changes too quickly. So there's quite a lot of work going on in the post-primary end of things and in the Dept end of things. So moving to the next one, hopefully if my, there's also legislation and definitions of guidance that I really would feel are important. Again, I was delighted to see that Nuala referenced the definition of guidance from the National Guidance Forum report. So rather than kind of sticking on those pieces, I want to move on and really offer commentary, if you like, on a couple of things in the context of Deirdre's comments and Nuala's presentation. There are significant activities with regard to the competencies that are expected of someone to deliver guidance. So again, Mary, Ryan, you would be very familiar in the context of delivering training for guidance counsellors. And this again is just to give you a kind of sense of the kind of work that is involved currently in an understanding of what a guidance counsellor engages. So again, rather than focus on that, I want to share with you a context. I think that it is extremely useful for you to know the progress that NCGE has engaged working. So NCGE, just so that you would be aware, we are now straddling two government departments, education. So it's education, the Department of Education in the school context, but also then in the further and higher education, research, innovation and science context. But in the school context, and I believe that this is fundamentally gives you a sense of where guidance thinking in our arena is coming from. They are taking on the whole school guidance framework rollout. So progress is happening in that, training has happened. School guidance is changing. And what I would hope, for example, is that those changes will in fact impact the people who are coming out of school, developing myself, developing my learning, and developing my career path. These are all aspects that are being integrated into post-primary education, and these are part of what needs to be integrated perhaps in the further education and training sector as well. I think it's important to note the Indicon report on career guidance, and the report was published 2 years ago. And 2 years ago, the recommendations really noted the significance that there was a need for a national policy group to develop a coherent and long-term strategy for lifelong guidance. So again, I think that it is important that we are aware of all of the different displays and purposes of guidance. So again, Nuala will have referred to, for example, employment guidance. And the question really, in a way, maybe, is it valid or is it useful? And how do we manage a distinction, for example, between employment guidance and education guidance, for example? Is that a meaningful thing anymore? So considerations from today. Number one, I have to say that I'm so gratified, I'm so pleased to hear so much commitment, I think, across the board to guidance. I've just a couple of minutes left. So I just want to say, in Deirdre's commentary where she's talking about the ecosystem and the development therein, I think it is vital. In Nuala's context, we're looking at, for example, enabling employment guidance and questioning what is guidance? What do we mean by that? And then we're looking at the question of toolkits and what is a metric about? What does an outcome mean? Is it that someone engages with employment? Is it that someone actually gets a job? Is it that that is sustainable? So there's sustainability for the individual, for the community, but there's also sustainability in terms of systems. So who's doing what? And let's avoid duplication and, in fact, confusion for the individual. So we need to distinguish between, and yet we need to integrate all of these pieces together. And therein lies the challenge. And I love the word leaderhood. Actually, I'm going to be using that one. I'm always talking about collaboration, communication, and cooperation as being significant. And there is a very good database for the adult guidance services, which is quite user-friendly, but needs a lot of work, but a really nice piece of research published by NCGE in December of 2020 by Dr. Petra Elfthorpe is on the website. The link is there. So we have considered digitalized guidance. We've looked at that from a national and an international point of view, and these are a range of different links. Can I finish simply by suggesting, I always like to finish with a sort of analogy, you know me. So in this case, I'm going to say that there are journeys involved. Journeys have been mentioned throughout guidance. But what I would ask and what I would suggest is that in these journeys, there are pit stops, there are times when we need to stop because the car breaks down. Perhaps you can't start the car in the first place. What are all these things and how do we manage them? So, for example, in a situation where there is the adult literacy, numeracy and digital skills strategy from DEFRIS, what does that mean for employability in terms of people's skill development? And I would encourage that we keep on talking to each other so that we actually collaborate and actually develop distinct but integrated and useful systems. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mary, for finishing totally on time. I'm very impressed. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your succinct response. Just being aware of time, I'm not going to give you a minute now because it will eat into Jenny Bimrose's time, and it's important that we give her space to respond to the presentations. Jenny is Emeritus Professor at the Institute for Employment Research at the University of Warwick, with over 40 years experience in higher education, researching, managing and teaching at postgraduate level. She has an extensive experience of external project management and consultancy, both in the UK and Europe. She was a member of the Careers Profession Task Force, convened by government 2010 and 2012, principal investigator for an ESRC seminar series on the careers profession 2010 to 2012. And she's a member of the boards of both the Journal for Vocational Behaviour and the International Journal of Vocation and Education Guidance, and therefore has a national and international perspective, which is very useful to us on the island. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, and hello to everybody, and thank you to the previous 4 speakers who've made my job extremely easy. I think I am a researcher. I have no organisational affiliation, and now I'm an emeritus professor. It means that I can be a very independent thinker. And I'm continuing to work in the field of career guidance. I've over the last decade been working around PES practitioners across Europe. So I was very privileged to be invited to have an involvement with this particular project, which has been incredibly impressive, I think, in terms of its outcomes. So I think I just pick out 3 themes from the previous speakers and things that I'm addressing in my research at the moment. We've heard from the speakers about transitions and about turbulent labour markets with change that is almost unimaginable, and the difficulties and complexities that all of us as individuals are now confronted with in a pandemic, which I think, unfortunately, is probably far from over. So I'm not using language like post-pandemic, but there are huge challenges for us all. And one of the things that is preoccupying me at the moment is that the practitioners of employment career guidance are undergoing these transitions themselves in the labour market, whilst simultaneously being expected to provide services to their customers and clients to a very high level. So that is, I think, an issue that needs to be addressed. Who and how supports the practitioners who are supporting our citizens? I think the second theme that has come out very strongly from the previous 4 speakers is, and I'm particularly grateful to Mary Stokes for putting sort of educational guidance on the map, because it's a reminder that our sector, per se, is deeply fragmented. We don't only have employment services and career guidance and education services, but there's a private sector and other sectors as well, charitable, and so on and so forth. And very often when we pause to think about these divisions, we are probably confronting the uncomfortable truth that the reasons for the divisions lay more in terms of policy priorities and convenience, rather than the needs of the consumers of the services that we're providing. The third point, I think, that has come out very strongly from the previous 4 presentations is the need and the urgent motivation that we all have to professionalize our services. I mean, I think professionalization is a tricky term to talk about because there is a lot of resistance to the notion of the profession of career guidance because of suspicions that it's elitist and protectionist and all sorts of other things. But if we put that aside for one moment and think rather of the professionalization, which is about uplifting the morale of practitioners and the quality of services that are being delivered, I think it's another very strong theme that is coming out from the speakers today. And if we then move to the toolkit that Nuala presented to us, it seems to me that not only is this a Herculean effort that needs to be loudly applauded, and I have done this before, but it is a vivid illustration of the complexity of our sector and the enormous potential of our sector to support citizens. It provides support to practitioners, and I started off by saying who and how a practitioner is being supported. It illustrates the fragmentation and the need for us all to work towards a more coherent service offer. And it seems to me to be a carrion call for engagement with professionalisation of the whole sector, whether or not we're calling it employment, education, career. And that toolkit does it all. I mean, it does the theory, it does the upskilling, it does the QA impact practice. It is an extraordinarily comprehensive document, and I know I'm nearly out of time. It does, I think, sadly reflect the deep segmentation of our sector, and in a sense, its title, employment guidance, is a sad reflection of that kind of division. And I think actually it's an extremely valuable resource for everybody in our sector, and hopefully it can actually be disseminated in that way. So to finish, Nuala said that she hoped that their work at Maynooth University will get or keep the discussion going. I would strongly endorse that and say that what we need is robust rhetoric at this time to consider the complexities of the issues that have been raised in this session. And hopefully we can, together with more uniformity and cohesion, provide higher quality services to our clients. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, for being equally succinct and keeping within the time. Very appreciative. We're coming towards the end. If, like me, you've had an engaging and interesting session, I want, on your behalf, to thank all the presenters. I am involved in guidance for very many years, and what is always useful to be reminded is the need for thinking and dialogue and the capacity to be open to new ways of being, because when we get very anxious, it's very hard to think. So I'd like to thank all the speakers, Deirdre, Nuala, Ciaran, Mary and Jenny, for providing us with a very rich session and for confirming, if we never knew it, that if we invest in practitioners, if we invest in our thinking and our skills, ultimately it is to the benefit of the clients. It's not a luxury, it's a necessity. Thank you all for attending. I wish you well and good luck for the next session. Take care.
Thank you, Mary Ryan, for chairing that previous session so excellently. And I think that session is a great illustration. We started off this morning with Fleming and Georgia talking about the research practice nexus and the importance of research translation. And I think what that toolkit does, the Model of Enabling Guidance Toolkit, is a powerful illustration of that translation of research into practice. And we're sort of circling back now in the next session. We've mentioned the special issue on Ireland's turn towards activation that Mary Murphy and myself have been guest editing with a whole range of contributors that are in attendance here today. And this special issue is really an attempt to kind of gather up the research that we have that's out there already on the experiences of activation from the kind of practitioner level, from the claimant, from the job seekers level, and kind of coalesce and distill that into a singular volume that we hope will be very, very accessible to a wide range of people and a wide audiences, both policy practitioners, both academic researchers, and of course, people that work in the delivery of these services as well. So to introduce the special issue, I'm delighted that we have Murish McCarthy coming to chair the session. Murish is an associate professor in politics and public administration at Queen's University, and he's also part of the advisory board for the Governing Activation in Ireland project. And Murish was also a staff member in the Institute of Public Administration in a former life. And the Institute of Public Administration is the body that publishes the journal Administration, which the special issue is a special issue of. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Murish, and he will chair the next session.
Excellent.
Thank you, Murish.
No problem, Michael. You can hear me okay? The routine check. Yep.
Grand.
Brilliant, excellent. Hello, everybody, and I'm really delighted. Greetings from Belfast, I should say. First of all, a slightly balmy, surprisingly balmy Belfast. And I'm really delighted and honoured to be chairing this final session. I know time is tight and we've quite a bit to get through, so I'll just say a few words before we get into the meat of this session, as it were. Well, first of all, the first thing to say is absolutely to congratulate Michael and Mary and colleagues in Maynooth on the conference today. I wasn't able to participate in all of it, but I was there at the start, and it just started off so well with some really chunky and very, very relevant themes that we're facing at the moment in terms of social policy provision in Ireland. This is a great session. You know, the purpose of this session is to launch the special issue, which Michael and Mary have co-edited. Just for those of you who don't know, the Journal Administration was founded in 1953. Its full title is Administration, the Journal of the Institute of Public Administration, where, as Michael said, I used to work. And it actually preceded the Institute itself. The Institute was founded in 1957 and Administration, as I say, was 1953. So it's coming up on approximately 80 years old, which is really fantastic for any journal. I took over as editor from Tony McNamara back in 2010, and I guess I saw you know, tremendous potential with the journal. There was a very large back catalogue that was maybe under a little bit of lock and key unnecessarily, so I sought to open it up. I mean, it's a publicly funded journal, so properly so, to get the back catalogue out, to introduce a double-blind peer review process, a new editorial board, and to start on the journey towards the social science citation index, the Web of Science, that the journal would feature and get international recognition. And my successor as editor, Joanna Reardon, has been just fantastic in sort of continuing to pursue that goal. It's a very competitive world. There's lots of public policy and administration journals out there now, but there's absolutely always going to be a need for a journal in Ireland that addresses domestic public policy issues. And as Michael just said, that really connects policy with practice in a rigorous way that meets critical academic standards. And it's very, very important that we maintain and sort of enhance those standards all the time. So in this vein, the special issue titled Activation and Welfare Reform in Ireland, edited by Michael and Mary, is an absolutely ideal fit. The subject matter is really important. I know you've been rehearsing about 2008 changing everything, and the pandemic, of course, but we tend to forget that just prior to the pandemic, you know, election 2020 in February last year exposed really new cleavages in Irish society, some generational, but also more classical left-right stuff about the role of the state in welfare provision, and particularly housing, which has remained a very dominant public policy problem in Ireland. And of course, because of the pandemic, we have these huge state interventions, and it's something of a crossroads now here as elsewhere in terms of what horizons we're looking at in terms of social policy. So I really like the comments of the opening session by Jean-Michel Bonvan about 3 issues to consider about the co-construction of public services, the temporality, and it's not just about equipping people for markets, but also about the markets themselves and creating valuable jobs. And I thought they were excellent points. So that's me just trying to set something of a scene, but without further ado, I think Michael has prepped the contributors to the volume that each of them is going to join and speak for a few minutes about their piece. And we'll have some responses then as well. So about 5 minutes each, and I will do my best to wave something of a stick to keep to time. So we'll begin. I see my former IPA colleague Anne-Marie McGarren has just unblocked pictures, or whatever the term is, herself. So Anne-Marie, will I hope open to you first of all for plugging the gaps for a more tailored public employment service. So this is co-authored with Helen Johnson from the National Economic and Social Council. So the virtual floor is yours. Oh, sorry, Helen, you're there as well. I beg your pardon.
Yes, actually, Helen is going to speak, actually. Thanks, Helen, for saving me from suddenly trying to remember what was in your notes.
There you go.
Thanks a million.
Okay, no problem. Nice to see you, Anne-Marie. Please, Helen, go ahead.
Okay. I just see, does this work?
Perfect. Yeah, we can see you.
Just hang on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and we can see your PowerPoint presentation if you want to.
Okay. All right. So listen, I know I've only 10 minutes, so I just want to say thanks very much for the opportunity to contribute to the administration journal, which Mauritius just described his origin and so on. So it's pretty prestigious to get published in this journal. So thank you for that. And the article that we have in it is co-authored by myself and Anne-Marie McGarren, who you've just met as well. So just to take you to the kind of overview of the article in the journal, it's about moving towards a more tailored public employment service. And we've heard lots about that today during the conference. So I'll just talk a little bit about the data source and then some of the gaps that we've identified in information, in training, in services that support employment, in links to employers, and then just make some concluding remarks. I'm not going to talk about some of the changes that have been made in Ireland's Public Employment Service, which are in the paper, but which have already been talked about today. So just then a little bit on the data source. It's based on a qualitative study of jobless households in a disadvantaged suburb of Dublin. It was undertaken in 2016-2017. So there has obviously been some changes since then. I can refer to those as I go through. So then the people that we talked to 33 jobless households. And in this study, jobless households are those in which adults spent less than 20% of their time in employment. So sometimes they're referenced as low work intensity households. And there was a range of household types here. We had nuclear families, lone parents, single people, quite a few multi-generational households actually. We have some traveller families, non-Irish nationals, and people living in emergency homeless accommodation. And in a lot of the households, there was somebody with a disability or illness mentioned. And we also spoke to 16 local services, both managers and frontline workers. These were employment support organisations, community centres, training centres, advisory centres and charities. We spoke to people who worked in county and regional services, mainly senior staff in the local authority and local agencies and other statutory organisations. We spoke to 11 local employers in the areas really where the people that we had spoken to were looking for work or maybe had previously worked. These are mainly low-skilled sectors, areas like retailing, cleaning, catering, hotels, care, construction, that type of work. We also spoke then to 12 people who were working in government departments and agencies, tended to be senior managers in those departments and agencies, and then also 9 other stakeholder groups. These were national representative organisations and academics, and they covered the areas of activation, education and training, employment conditions and regulation, enterprise development, social inclusion, community development, housing, care, disability, and position of migrants and travellers. So we thought we had a fairly comprehensive overview of people that we spoke to inform our work. So then on just to the gaps that we identified. The first one was the gaps in information. And one of the things was about patchy career guidance, and we've just been discussing that in the last session. And here really we find that career guidance was in the main provided, but it was variable in terms of what was available to people. So we had some reference to speed dating, that when people met their intro officers, they only had an allocated amount of time, and quite often it was a referral, more of a referral process, and there wasn't an adequate time really consider in depth what kind of career guidance might be suitable. Also, the skills of the intro officers varied. Some had been trained in providing career guidance, whereas others hadn't. And it was just hit and miss really, what officer that people got. And people who were furthest from the labour market perhaps needed more guidance, and that wasn't always available. And then, as we heard earlier as well, those people who aren't clients of Intria have no clear place to go. And then a second issue we found was some people had difficulty navigating the range of training on offer. And in our article, we have a list of all the training, or a diagram showing all that training. But there's a lot of different eligibility criteria and so on that's required to go on that training. And some people found it difficult to find their way around that. So then when we moved on to look at specifically gaps in training, there was gaps in the volume or the amount of training that was available. For example, there was limited places in some of the sought after courses, and many of these courses would have had strong links to the labour market, such as warehouse operations. For some as well, there was restricted eligibility criteria for some English language courses, and that was for people who were working, quite often couldn't avail of any free English language classes. And then there was some concern about the adequacy of literacy provision, where there was 2 hours available. Now that was increased to 10 hours per week, but not always followed in practice. And for people who benefited from literacy provision, it really helped in their job seeking. So there was also some gaps in the assessment of trainees' existing knowledge. There were people who were sent on courses that were too basic. For example, we talked to somebody who'd done computers studies in school, and yet then he was sent on a very basic computer course where they were taught how to switch on the computer. And then on the other side, there was somebody who was interested in setting up their own business, but had limited literacy, and yet he was sent on a course where people needed to have a leaving certificate to avail of the knowledge and information. And then finally, in this section, there were gaps in the recognition of foreign qualifications for many people, and we've heard quite a bit about that in the press anyway, but that means then that there's lots of migrants working in jobs which are below their qualification level. The third area then was the gaps in services that support employment. And again, this is quite common, and we need really to have joined up services for this. So there's a number of areas here, and one is childcare, both the cost and the availability of childcare, particularly maybe for lone parents, find it difficult to take up jobs if they had to then pay for childcare. And also the availability of childcare, especially at after school and out of hours times. We now do have the National Childcare Scheme that has been introduced since the research was undertaken, but this is still only available for certified childcare centres, and a lot of people avail of childminders, so there's still some issues around that. In terms of transport, what we found was a lot of people, some people were trying to travel across the city by public transport, and this is taking a long time and also costing money, especially for people on minimum wage jobs. And maybe the Bus Connects will be able to deal with some of that. Access to IT, people didn't always have email addresses or didn't always have a computer or a laptop that they could access. Now they could go to the library or to the community centres, but we've really seen this come into sharp focus, I think, with the pandemic, where people haven't really been able to avail of opportunities if they haven't had good access to IT. Housing was a major issue and continues to be quite clearly. For people who were living in local authority housing, they were able to look at job opportunities and avail of them because they had secure housing and because there was a differential rent scheme in place, and so it was affordable. But for people in the private rented sector in particular, there was the insecurity, there was the cost. Initially there was the rent supplement in place when we did the research. The HAP was just being introduced, so people were reluctant to take up jobs if they lost their rent supplement. And now, even with the housing assistance payment, which is gradually withdrawn as income increases, it's just difficult for people to find accommodation. Quite often it's it's more expensive than the HAP allows for. And the people are competing against many others for any housing that's available. And then also the area of the medical card, and everybody that we talked to was on social welfare, but and so had a medical card, but there's this fear of losing it, even though people can keep it for 3 years after they take up a job and sometimes for longer. There is just really a fear of losing that medical card over time. And so a lot of these things really do point to, a case management approach and greater collaboration between agencies. And so the fourth area then, the final area on which there were gaps, was in links to employers. And here we had heard of people who were on community employment schemes, for example, but rather than then transitioning on into employment, quite often they ended back up on the dole. So there's that lack of transitional support to link with employers. And then also there was gaps in training links. There's a lot of training centres had limited employment engagement, and there's a number of reasons for this. Whenever FOSS was there, and then the Intrio kind of absorbed both FOSS and income support, and some of those previous links were broken because of this organisational change. There was also now more contracting out and sometimes less staff involved in making links with employers. And few courses actually included work experience, but for those that did, people who were availing of work experience were making stronger links to employment and subsequently were more hopeful of getting jobs. Now, this was in the days whenever the regional skills fora were still being set up when we did the research, so they may help here. So now just some concluding remarks. I think the reforms to Ireland's public employment service, as we've heard today, are in line with what is happening elsewhere in terms of kind of a more active focus, activation with some conditionality. And so gaps do exist, as we just highlight in this article, though some of those are now being addressed. But it does illustrate the challenges in tailoring a public employment service to meet diverse needs, and that people with complex needs do require more intensive engagement, and that needs to be supported by a conducive wider policy environment and interagency cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. I'm trying to go back on camera here. Some higher power. Oh, there we go. I'm being allowed to put my camera on there. Thank you very much, Helen and Anne-Marie. And I said, you know, to Michael, time is short, so I can't go on about what I thought of each of the papers, but I really love this. And I think it's so important to have these critical evaluations and getting behind the headline figures of employment and underemployment and activation measures. And it was just fascinating to read. And the next paper actually continues on of getting into that sort of the experiential evidence of the consequences, I guess, of these policy reforms. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Philip Finn, if he's there. Yes, they are. Hi, Philip. So we'll just keep going, and then we'll come to the two respondents at the end. So Philip, first of all, congratulations on your contribution to the special issue, and the floor is yours just to summarize it, I guess, for people, but it's really fascinating to read.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, so I'm Philip Finn. I'm assistant lecturer in the Department of Sociology, and the argument and data that I'm really presenting today is from the PhD that I did a couple of years ago, and I'm basically going to jump right in because I'm not the best with time management, so it's probably best if I crack on. So just in terms of a broad overview, we can say in the last 10 years, Pathways to Work has instigated a new kind of welfare trajectory, intensifying the link between social security provision and work, emphasizing a lifelong attachment to the labour market based around the intensification of conditionality, particularly behavioural conditionality, the contractualisation of the encounter, personal progression plans, job search activity, and evidence of such, and as well as sanctions. And we're starting to see an emerging literature coming out, trying to make sense of the experience of claimants. And I think there's a bit of a tension in that literature at the minute. On the one hand, you kind of get a sense that it is a relatively benign system with some advantages in terms of engagement, both for caseworkers and for claimants as well, and as well as reports coming out from the department that highlight positive interactions with the services as well. And on the other hand, there's a more critical kind of qualitative based approach from within academia that kind of identified more as being a kind of degrading and punishing form of experience, kind of reflecting a lot of the literature from the UK, which identifies that system as being quite a brutalizing one in terms of material hardship and emotional turmoil as people engage in the process as well. So I'm kind of, I suppose, inserting myself into that debate with this paper, which, as I said, is based on PhD research, which included 42 interviews with job seekers in Kildare, which is in the east of the country. 22 of those were male, 20 women, and they included 11 lone parents as well, due to the extension of conditionality to lone parents as a group as well. So just jumping into the findings, I would say probably the main finding coming out of it was this idea of superficial conditionality, where the process seemed to be primarily concerned with a bureaucratic procedure. And claimants constantly talked about how their caseworkers were quite decent to them, but they found the entire process was about box ticking or pen pushing. And that kind of manifests particularly in relation to job search evidence, where there was seemingly a lack of an obligation in providing it, which is what Chris is talking about in the quote on the slide there, where he talked about he would throw in two or three kind of casual jobs that he had looked for rather than 10 that had been stated earlier on in the trajectory. and Bob as well, who said that he'd never actually been asked for job search evidence, and his caseworker just told him to keep a record of it for himself in case he had a more stringent caseworker down the line. But also in relation to the record of mutual commitments and personal progression plans that all job seekers have to sign. These were never really specifically collected. And actually, I brought along my own documents that from my own experience of being on welfare, and kind of to prompt a recollection. And it did get a kind of a vague recollection where people had some kind of recognition that these were signed sometime in the past, but like really just in order to get access to the payments. And particularly in relation to the personal progression plan as well, where that was recalled, it tended to be something that was carried out by the caseworker with very little input actually coming from the participant or the claimant themselves. And then finally, in relation to sanctions as well, there was only 2 out of the 42 people that I interviewed were actually sanctioned, and both had their monies reinstated actually after engaging. And explicit threats of sanction were also quite rare in interactions. And I think that reflects the relatively low level of sanctions in Ireland comparative to other places, but also the disparities between non-engagement, for example, in job pat as opposed to the much lower rate of sanctions. But nonetheless, the threat of sanctions is always there, and claimants were vaguely aware that it were there. They were reminded constantly through any kind of correspondence they had with services. So there's a superficial conditionality operating at a distance, but it's nonetheless structuring the encounter and imposing a necessity of engagement upon claimants and kind of compelling a minimum participation to ensure keeping their payments. And this had a tendency to produce particular kinds of performances from job seekers, and Erving Goffman has talks about the way in which we present ourselves in particular ways across social contexts in order to meet social expectations or to try and mitigate negative interpretations of ourselves. So trying to avoid stigmatized identities, for example. So the kind of dramaturgical performances that were happening within the welfare offices here are a form of trickery, I think, based around the idea of the good job seeker, who was someone who was enthusiastic, relentless drive in the face of rejection or failure, and motivated for any job, even a bad job. And due to the system operating with a kind of superficial bureaucratic procedure, claimants could then use this as an inventive possibility to circumvent the obligations and kind of pursue their own interests, needs, and desires. And quite often that came about through a kind of feigned compliance, which Nick is talking about there, where he would submit kind of borderline ridiculous job search evidence in order just to satisfy the criteria, as well as forms of impression management, where Alexia, for example, talked about presenting particular kinds of behaviors to manage the relationship with caseworkers, which was often a kind of a deferential performance to situate the caseworker as being the expert in the situation, and would allow her then to pursue her own interests, much like Nick. I think Nick was building a boat at the time, and Alexia was pursuing a postgraduate degree as well. Now, there's the possibility of a specious reading of this, that these people are just feckless, irresponsible, and what we actually need now is more conditionality, more use of sanctions. And I would say that that's wrong, very wrong, because these kind of strategies that people were doing were always grounded in a wider context and a kind of self-understanding of participants' own situation. And for example, the feasibility of the type of work that was on offer or possible for them, and how this intersected with other forms of welfare provisions that they were in receipt of. And the safety of the limited security of welfare, as opposed to the insecurity of potentially low pay, insecure work with poor conditions that might actually push them back onto welfare fairly quickly. So what I argue is that what is lacking is a form of genuine engagement with people's needs, interests, and circumstances. And in many instances, actually, claimants misrecognized welfare agencies as being caring services there to help them, which was something then that was largely missing or lacking in their everyday experience of engaging in the services. For example, participants talked about how their individual circumstances regarding financial situations, mental health, caring responsibilities were not taking it into account, and it was just this kind of superficial imposition of paid employment as a necessity. And this kind of points to, I think, careless activation, which Mary Murphy has talked about in the past, and the kind of particular gendered patterns that this can take. For example, mothers and particularly lone parents, their kind of care and responsibility for the children and domestic work and housework that is falls mostly on the shoulders of women. Still, these were just kind of ignored within the process and kind of not understood or taken account of at all. And even when it came to work, the type of work that people wanted to do or what they were interested in, how they might get to that, had very little kind of discussion, as well as kind of how to find and what the target work. The participant said there was very little kind of practical assistance forthcoming, but it seems that the process was just more concerned with ensuring a superficial kind of compliance, and that they were in fact actually looking for work. So what I suggest is that there's not a punitive tendency that's similar to the UK and other jurisdictions, but rather what we get is a kind of a form of indifference which frustrates the agency of claimants and quite often drives them into dramaturgical performances that I showed on the previous slide. Oh, sorry. So just as way of conclusion, there seems to be two modes of superficiality at play. The first one is the way in which conditionality operates as a bureaucratic procedure overly focused on box tickets. So there's quite a strong rhetoric within Pathways to Work and even replicated in the media at times from politicians, which is not matched by implementation. Secondly is the inability or the unwillingness, and I think it's the former, of caseworkers to offer what is perceived as genuine engagement that addresses, needs and interests and circumstances. So within this, there's a misalignment of interests, I think. So caseworkers at times do take a kind of protective, caring interest in their claimants. For example, in the case of Bob and his caseworkers, sometimes it's more negative imposing of conditionality and sanctions, although that was rare enough in an explicit form. And finally, mostly it came in terms of neglecting the interests and kind of needs and circumstances that people found themselves in. So it's producing an institutional indifference in which claimants are kind of, their needs and interests seemingly have little relevance in the process. Yet there's an implicit recognition of control, of conditionality and sanction structure in the encounter, which is generative of the dramaturgical performances. So just quickly getting to the end, I think in looking at our post-COVID future, this is unlikely to be suited to returning people to work, many of whom will be unused to interactions with welfare agencies. They're going to have complex and differentiated needs that are going to need new forms of knowledges and a new form of labour activation practices. As well as that, just very quickly to finish, I think there's also a need to think beyond a productivist framework to a broader conception of welfare that decouples welfare from work and the obligation of paid work and is rooted in the everyday lives of individuals and communities. For example, one of the nice things that I found in my research was that even though people were unemployed, they still led very full, active lives. For example, people were engaged in writing comedy, they were engaged in making musical instruments, they were engaged in learning new languages, they were engaged, just more time with their family and their children as well. But it was when they were prompted to reflect on this as in relation to paid employment and its absence, it was then that these things kind of took on a very negative tone. And I'll finish with a quote of one person I interviewed who said that since he'd been made unemployed, he had become more involved in his children's lives, in their schoolwork and in their sports work. And then he kind of just paused for a minute and reflected on it and just said, but I know they see me as a failure. So I think we need to start to think beyond that kind of link between welfare and work and how the work ethic can be reinforced in a very negative kind of way through the welfare system. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Phil. Sorry, I'll start the video again. Philip, thanks so much. Absolutely fascinating to read. And actually, you might drop me an email. I had some thoughts about some literatures I think you'll find really interesting to build on that. But it's a fantastic work, which I really congratulate you on. I know time is against us, so I'll keep moving on to our next paper, which has a really nice concept of insiders and outsiders in terms of welfare provision. So Nuala Whelan from Maynooth University, the paper is titled Opening the Black Box of Implementing Activation in Ireland. And I should have said at the start, of course, please, if people want to fire some questions or reflections into the chat box, please do, because today isn't the end of the event, and we all sort of try to use the collective intelligence here to provoke new questions and ideas and share knowledge. So Nuala, please go ahead.
Great, thanks so much, Mars. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, I hope you can see that okay. Okay, yeah, so my presentation, similar to Philip's, is based on one of the studies from my PhD. So opening the black box of implementing activation in Ireland. So I thought just maybe to start, just in terms of some background, just to acknowledge that unemployment has individual social and economic impacts, and governments are constantly focusing on ways to ameliorate some of these impacts, some of these negative impacts. And I suppose the trend in the last 30 years or so has been to move towards activation and activation policies internationally. And these policies vary really, systems vary across countries, and we don't find exact replications of activation in various countries. But Ireland, and in this context, was really a latecomer, and it was as a result of the rapid increase in unemployment from 4.4% to 15% over a four-year period as a result of the Great Recession. I suppose that really kind of projected Ireland into this space. And Ireland had entered the Great Recession with this very underdeveloped activation strategy. So the public employment services was really quite overcome in terms of its capacity to deal with the numbers of people needing these services. So a really important point, I suppose, in Ireland's trajectory towards activation. And I just tried to kind of map that out a little bit by a bit of a timeline here. So really from the kind of the 2008, the crisis levels of unemployment started, but there were also a number of important evaluations, OECD evaluations, and so on, that really, I suppose, focused in on Ireland's weak activation policy and its potential, difficulties in tackling the unemployment figures that we were dealing with. So as a result of all of that and unfortunate corporate governance scandals and issues in FÁS at the time and its closure, there was a significant restructuring of Ireland's public employment services and the income support system from about 2011. So really from 2011 to about 2016, a really significant change in the landscape of public employment services, and the new activation strategies pathways to work was rolled out. And during the 2013 to 2016 period, there were 60 plus Intrio offices established across the country, and the introduction then of job paths. So a really changed landscape from what we were used to looking at pre-2008. So my study really tried to track some of that, and I was very interested in a range of stakeholders that were involved in this change, but that really weren't in control of the change, but were really impacted by it, and what their perceptions of this change and this move towards activation was. So the study set out to look at that in a bit more depth. So it was an explorative, qualitative approach that I used, based around the North Dublin region, 21 participants, 14 females, 7 males, and you can see the stakeholder groups there: job seekers, other stakeholders. So the other stakeholders were kind of ancillary services that were maybe working with job seekers but weren't directly delivering employment services. Practitioners and service managers, both of whom came from the local employment services, and policymakers. And I really wanted this to be a bottom-up approach, so I really wanted to try and let that data speak for itself. So the themes that emerged were very much based on their contributions to the research. And I know it's a small scale study, so of course, to take that into consideration when we're looking at some of these themes that emerge. So I tried to analyze it from an insider-outsider perspective. So insiders were people who were involved in the change process, policymakers, managers, practitioners who were either working within the system, who either had influence or where the system was influencing on their own work. And then outsiders were job seekers and the other stakeholders who were receiving the services. And you can see there, I've tried to I suppose visualize some of the themes that came out for the various different stakeholder groups. But I'm going to focus in on the three macro themes, really, that when I pulled all of this data up into try and get something a bit more tangible to be able to present today. So the three key themes that came out from all of the interviews that I conducted were this kind of sense of depersonalization of the system, the missing how-to of implementation, and the reform agenda. So each of the following slides is kind of just a breakdown of those themes, but also some quotes, which I won't read out, but I'll just leave on the bottom of these slides that you can have a read of yourself. So the first theme of depersonalization was really spoken about by job seekers and practitioners, and job seekers described the experience of unemployment as a dehumanizing experience and the importance of person-centered approaches in facilitating access to employment again, but also enhancing their self-esteem and helping them feel human again within, and I know Philip mentioned there the careless systems, but a kind of a caring type of public employment service really did support them back to feeling human again. And the practitioners spoke about this trusting client-practitioner relationship and its importance in being able to help the client disclose some of the complex issues that they were dealing with or the challenges that they had to re-employment, but that when the Pathways to Work system, its focus on administration, on eligibility, on monitoring, on regulation was very opposing of that previous type of model, and they felt that really impacted on their ability to be able to really engage with the clients, and that there was the primary purpose of the client practitioner relationship and the meetings had shifted from one of support to one that really focused on job placement and effectiveness based on employment metrics. So a real kind of shift away from the person-centered approaches to something more administrative. The second theme, which is the missing how-to of implementation, this was mainly spoken about by managers and stakeholders. So they maintained that the depersonalization that the clients and practitioners experienced resulted from deficiencies in the how-to of implementing the policy, and that there was a real sense of a top-down directive that was shaping the service, and which was really primarily focused on adhering to rules rather than a person-centered approach. And this was really at the expense of utilizing the available skills that were existing within the system. So ex-FOSS and LES staff were very experienced and skilled in using adult guidance methods and approaches to working with clients, but this wasn't tapped into. And the managers and stakeholders really questioned whether this new system constituted a public employment service because it excluded much of the working age population and really only focused on the live register. And there was a real sense of frustration that this new system was kind of uninformed and under-evaluated and had come from this very kind of top-down process. And then the third theme, the reform agenda, I suppose is an interesting one. Well, I found it as a working organizational psychologist, I found this very interesting that policymakers and managers spoke about the reform largely from an organizational change perspective, and that the effectiveness and implementation of this new system was being measured in terms of a successful reform process rather than an improved service to job seekers, and improving the outcomes for job seekers. And that the terms like physical reform, establishment of in-trio staff mergers, changes within the department, all of these kinds of organizational development language had been introduced into the public employment services, which I found, I have to say, quite interesting. there was also a kind of a sense that there was a lack of consultation with the NGO sector, and this was perceived as a real missed opportunity because there was a really quite extensive experience on the ground for many years, but that wasn't tapped into. There was no engagement or consultation with that. And interestingly, there was a sense that everyone was working for the department, that these new systems had really, the charity organizations, NGOs, community sector organizations were all changing their systems to be able to fit with this new model. So quite an interesting, impact at a wider level, not just within the department itself. So just some takeaway points really that I suppose for me to be able to carry out a qualitative study, although it's a small scale qualitative study, I think it's a valuable, it gives a valuable perspective that's often missing from the broader evaluation literature, which is mostly focused on quantitative types of studies. So I've tried to dig deeper to get an understanding of experiences and perceptions over this period of time. And while the activation reforms were progressing, I think it's really interesting to note that there was a limited perceived effectiveness about promoting important employability factors such as well-being, career efficacy, perceived employability, and we can really see the regulatory and disciplinary aspects of activation policies being implemented at the expense of more enabling ones. And this is similar to other liberal welfare states such as the UK and Australia. I think they've said, that there's been a similar experience. The clear policy goals were defined, so that the what of the policy, the policy goals were defined, but definitely deficiencies in policy implementation in terms of the missing middle. And Evelyn Brodkin talks a lot about this missing middle, being able to, track the practices of activation that take shape on the ground to really be able to understand what activation is doing with the clients that are coming into the services. And the reform agenda then in terms of the lack of an evidence-informed process in consultation, I think it's really important that it seemed to have come from a more administrative place and a top-down type of reform, which was really impacting on the services that were being delivered to clients. So collectively, these findings suggest that the vertical implementation and control of activation reform has led to this highly administrative and work-first activation approach in Ireland, but more work is needed to keep tracking what's happening. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nuala. That was really succinct and a really fascinating paper as well. Oh, sorry, start my video here again. Great. So, there's lots of things we could talk about, but I know I keep saying time is against us. So we'll move straight on then to our final presenter before we come to the responses. And this is Fiona Ducolo from UCC, who I've only met really in the last year or so. Fiona, I think through the Public Policy Specialist Group of the Political Studies Association of Ireland, which she's involved. So a real titan of this work in Irish social policy in Ireland. So really delighted to see you again, Fiona. And the title of Fiona's article is Sacrificial Citizens, Activation and Retrenchment in Ireland's Political Economy. So Fiona, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Nourish. I'm just going to share my screen as well.
Yeah, that's good.
Sorry, I'm just trying to get my slide share up, but that's not working. I might just keep going then. Sorry, you're going to have to see my slides on the side as well.
That's fine. No, it's perfect.
So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you to all of the other presenters. This has been a really interesting session, and so has the whole day. So it's really great to be part of this conference and to have the opportunity to present alongside such interesting contributions from other people. And I think a lot of the work in this session, just following on from Nuala's final point, is really points to the importance of qualitative research that offers very rich insights into what's happening on the ground in terms of how policy translates into practice. And I think it's just a really welcome departure. And so congratulations to everyone in Maynooth for carving out this space and pushing on with this research, and also with the contribution that NESC has made in this space. So I think it makes a really good contribution that goes beyond numerical data. But having said that, my presentation kind of goes back into numerical data a little bit. I'm getting a message saying my internet connection is unstable. Am I audible?
Yeah, there's been no break at all, Fiona. Keep going.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Bruce. So, so my paper is based on a critical commentary. Michael and Mary asked me to provide a critical commentary on activation and retrenchment in the context of what's been happening since 2008 crisis in Ireland. And so the title of that is called Sacrificial Citizens, Activation and Retrenchment in Ireland's Political Economy. And my starting point is the Pathways to Work document 2016 to 2020. And I draw on a key point at the start of that document where it says that a key aspect or a key aim of activation, especially in terms of economic recovery, is to increase active labour market participation by people of a working age, including people with disabilities and lone parents, so as to help ensure a supply of labour at competitive rates and to minimise welfare dependency. So this is probably, it's nothing new here. Everybody's probably familiar with the aims and the language of policy and so on. But I just wanted to say that the significance of this really didn't hit home to me until I was giving a presentation on activation at the European Trade Union Institute in Brussels in 2018. And I just quoted this again. And one of the respondents to my paper remarked on how violent this aim of activation was. And that was kind of strange language to me. And I'm aware that it's a very contentious thing to say about activation. But I kind of felt that it revealed maybe some of the underpinnings of Irish activation policy post the crisis and onwards, in kind of hiding in plain sight. And that remark made at that time was kind of made at a form of, in a sense of critical distance from the Irish context. And I think that's quite valuable to try and adopt some critical distance from kind of the nuts and bolts of policy reform, the constraints everybody has to work under, and the assumptions and policy imperatives that we kind of take for granted. So in my commentary, I kind of reflect on that a little bit more, but also kind of want to acknowledge that just the importance of activation, the importance of the right to decent work, and what Sheila Orloff calls the right to be commodified. So I'm not dismissing that, but it's a critical commentary on the direction that activation policy has taken in Ireland. So a frame that I've used to conceptualize the contribution is this notion of sacrificial citizens, which comes from a paper by Wendy Brown. And I think it's kind of useful to think of a continuum from a classic notion of social citizenship to this notion of sacrificial citizenship, where she talks about the economization of political and social life. So work and citizenship are configured as modes of belonging to the business of the team one works for, or the nation of which one is a member. So in the sense of the pathways to work policy aim, you might say then that all working age adults to be activated are seen in terms of their value as a competitive labour supply. And in the process, the value of social protection is displaced by the notion of welfare dependency and the need to minimise it. So in a way, welfare dependency goes from what was once a very contentious term to something that is normalised and taken for granted. That's kind of a framing device for the commentary that I've contributed. But at the same time, if you look at how policy has evolved, and if you look at that in the context of retrenchment, you can kind of see a different treatment for different groups. So there's a sense of what you might call a hierarchy of sacrificial citizenship. So in the paper, I look at retrenchment and look at how it's connected with activation, and I take a kind of classic framework for retrenchment, which comes from work by Paul Pearson. So he outlines this notion of programmatic retrenchment, which means a reduction in rights or levels of protection, and how you can see that or track it in terms of reliance on means-tested benefits. a change in benefits and eligibility rules that change the qualitative or signal a qualitative reform of a particular program, and major transfers of responsibility to the private sector. And then he also talks about systemic retrenchment, which is kind of harder to identify or grasp, but what he refers to it as ways in which programs can remain intact, but are weakened in various ways, including by the shaping of public opinion. So that's kind of the framing of the paper, and I'm just going to zip through some of the key points in terms of how that task is worked through in the paper, and some of the data on kind of reduction in rights and social protection and so on, which forms the context in which activation policy is unfolding. So first of all, looking at how social insurance has evolved vis-a-vis means-tested payments. For people who are unemployed, there's been quite a shift in the payment system over the period of the crisis over to 2019, so pre-pandemic. So in 2008, it's interesting to note that there were marginally more unemployed people claiming job seekers benefit than there were job seekers allowance. And over time, then we see a widening gap, more people having to transfer to or rely on job seekers allowance as opposed to job seekers benefit, even as the unemployment rate is subsiding. And we're probably quite maybe familiar or take as normal the means-tested regime for social protection in Ireland, but it does kind of add another layer of conditionality or insecurity or intrusiveness in the experience of unemployed people and how they relate to the social protection system. And part of this is a consequence of the types of retrenchment in the system since 2008, particularly in terms of tighter rules around contributions to social insurance, a reduction in the duration of job seekers benefit and so on. So this is a consequence. When we move to non-job seeking working age welfare recipients, this maps the number of people on assistance-based payments versus the number of people on insurance-based payments. So there's much less of a distinct pattern here, but over time there's a bit of a gap emerging, or a growing gap emerging between the number of people on assistance-based or means-tested payments versus those on insurance-based payments. And if you look down into the composition of programs or payments that are means-tested, you can kind of see some changes in composition, which kind of parallel maybe what you might call a hierarchy of activation. So this is stuff, again, that everybody more or less would be familiar with. We're seeing the, as noted by many other people, the gradual conversion of parents to job seekers by job seekers transitional payment. We're seeing what's called a migration of people, or a rise in disability allowance claimants. And that can be set in the context of a gradual change of status of disability in the social protection system, where it's kind of gradually being seen more as a capacity to work issue, which is both desired on the one hand by people with disabilities, but also kind of aligns with the activation agenda. We also see the uneven end of pre-retirement allowance, which kind of imposes more conditionality on older workers. People under 62 are still subject to the full conditionalities of job seekers payments. Prior to 2011, people were able to transfer to pre-retirement allowance after the age 55. Then we also have a significantly kind of hidden cohort of qualified adults. They're becoming increasingly visible, possibly as a policy problem, and perhaps being cast as an issue in terms of labour supply. I'm going to skip these, which just documents some of those changes. Then there's the changes in benefit and eligibility rules, kind of following Pearson's framework. And Philip has already talked a lot about this in a really, really interesting way. And I think his work makes a fantastically valuable contribution. And so here, I think there's kind of a tendency to go around in circles around what do the penalty rates and numbers of sanctions in Ireland mean? Are they high? Are they low? How do they compare to other countries? And so we kind of have one assessment which says they're more benign than sanction norms in other countries, and they certainly are that in contrast to what might be considered our more illiberal neighbour in the UK. The OECD calls them kind of heading towards OECD norms, and other people consider them particularly punitive. But whatever benchmark you use, I think in a qualitative sense or a textual sense in terms of the relationship between citizen and state or citizen and service, it does change the nature of that relationship, which I think is brought out very well in Philip's paper. And then I think there's probably also an undocumented hassle effect, where the desire to be left alone or the desire not to be hassled potentially pushes people into the labour market when they're not particularly well equipped or where they don't necessarily get sustainable, decent work over the long term. Then the final part of Pearson's programmatic retrenchment framework is major transfers of responsibility to the private sector, which has been discussed in a lot of detail already by Michael and others, so I'm not going to dwell on this. Then the final question of systemic retrenchment. So there's all sorts of ways you can go here in terms of looking what this means or how we might understand whether it's occurring in the Irish context. And there's just one piece of data I draw on here. It's the European Social Survey, which did a module on welfare attitudes in 2008 and again in 2016. And there's just one point I wanted to pick up from that survey. When Irish respondents participated in the period from 2008 to 2016, we can kind of see compelling evidence of a growth in pro-social or pro-welfare attitudes. And so people are more disposed to smaller differences in living standards for fairness, a greater kind of sense that social services don't place a strain on the economy, but we're still an outlier in Europe in that term. Then finally, some questions are asked about unemployed people, and it's interesting to note the opposite direction in attitudes here, that there's a hardening of attitudes towards unemployed people between 2008 and 2016. So more people, for example, are more likely to agree with the statement that most unemployed people do not really try to find a job. So that raises all sorts of questions about why those attitudes have hardened and whether it's an indication of systemic retrenchment or not. But it's something to be noted and something that probably requires more research and raises lots of questions there in terms of the last 4 to 5 years as well, and the election that Mirish referred to, and the kind of the seismic shifts that's been happening in Ireland in the last 1 or 2 years. So finally, to kind of conclude with the question of, are we seeing sacrificial consequences? And what we know probably mostly relates to lone parents. So there's been a lot of more quantitative research with lone parents. So we know we have quite a lot of evidence that documents loss of income for lone parents as they go through the activation process. We see a rise in work poverty and a deterioration of parent and child well-being. And the wider context for that, and the context in which pathways to work has unfolded, is the fact that there's a high incidence of low pay in Ireland and a risk of cycling in and out of work welfare, which NESC has referred to in their research, and Citizens Information has also referred to in terms of the future direction of activation policy. So kind of a final question then is asking whether by using activation to ensure a supply of labour at competitive rates, do we risk what's called malemployment, where the boundaries between employment and unemployment are blurred and conditions of poverty and insecurity are common to both states. And I think that's a really pertinent question as we look at what type of activation services unfold in a pandemic recovery period. So thanks very much.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Fiona. And it's such a nice compliment. I mean, the data you're presenting there to the previous presenters, and again, what makes it for such an excellent special issue that, you know, there's something for everybody in here. We were scheduled to finish just about now, but if everybody could stay on for, maybe we'll have a final 10 minutes. I know it's been a long day, but a very rich day, and I know it's Friday evening as well. But out of respect to our two responders who've been sitting on and listening, I'd like to hand over straight away to Reid O'Brien from INOU and Dr. Delma Byrne, also from Department of Sociology in Maynooth. So Reid, would you like to respond to what you've heard? And again, thank you, Fiona. Sorry to be so abrupt at the end, but it's a really, really fascinating work. There we go, Reid. We can see you if you just want to unmute. Yeah, go ahead, Reid, please. Yeah,
okay.
And I'm very sorry, Reid. Just a couple of minutes. I'm sorry to be putting limits on your time here, but I know.
Fair enough. So do I have 5 just to check, Mirish?
Go for it. Go for it. Go for it. 5 minutes.
Fair enough. Okay, thanks very much. A very interesting day. I must say, I was involved in some of the work with Mary and Nuala and Ciaran and others, and it's been a very interesting project to be involved in, and it will be great to see more of this work and research work being developed and explored. In terms of the papers, the Institute of Public Administration, as somebody who's been mindful of, keeping an eye on, commenting on, challenging, been part of within our own organisation research on it in terms of people's experiences when what we called the intro model started to be rolled out by intro itself, then the local employment service, and then job path, and exploring people's experiences of it, and what we would like to see in a public employment service. The papers were very interesting because in terms of just they're a nice recap of the issues and challenges that we have seen taking place over the past decade. In terms of the paper that Anne-Marie and Helen have done, I think that it really is important that and others have raised this morning, we need a public employment service that has the capacity to engage with everybody who wants to use that service. It cannot just focus in on people in receipt of a particular payment. It has to be open and available to everybody of working age. Now, we are assured by the department that indeed, you know, that the service is open, but feedback we get is that if you're not in receipt of a particular payments, trying to engage with the public employment service is problematic. And I think that is particularly so for people who maybe have a variety of challenges in their lives, a variety of responsibilities, whose maybe experience of the world of work is elsewhere, maybe their experience of the world of work is limited, maybe their educational attainment is not where it would need to be, particularly if they wish to access a decent job. And who doesn't want to access a decent job? So I think trying to address the challenges that face people for whom that is their lived experience, we need to have an employment service that has the capacity to do that. We can't do as we've done with our social welfare system, keeping adding on bits, and then it gets to a point where the whole thing is like, is it going to keep standing? Or indeed, when the pandemic hit and the political system looked at the social welfare supports and thought, oh, they're not adequate for the job. They won't address the challenge that is now facing us, that this health crisis has presented us with. So we need a public employment service that is built around the person, that offers them good advice, good assistance, and good supports. For some people, that's a case of just them being maybe pointed in the right direction, their confidence been enhanced, and off they go and they're gone, and the system might see them again for many a long year. Other people, the journey is longer. And for some people, the journey will be a few steps forward, a few steps back, or they may just take a different route. And the system has to have the capacity to do that. And that's why the role of guidance is so important. and that we ensure that as people make the journey through the system, that they are indeed engaging with the person who is best placed to advise them at that particular point in time. And I just think Philip's paper really highlighted the difficulties when you reconfigure a system, but you don't ensure that the staff you have in place have the skill set, the capacity, the competencies to be able to support the people using that system in a way that they need those supports. We really do need a public employment service that isn't one where people feel, oh God, I better go to it, because if I don't, I'll lose some money, or I might lose all my money. But actually one where people go, you know, God, could I go for that job? Is that for me? And they know they can go down the road and engage with and talk with the people in the public employment service who will advise them about what is the best and most appropriate option for them. So we really do need to build that system. We really do need to build the skill sets. And I thought that Nuala's paper just very much highlights the challenge. And this, I think in many ways, a lot of this challenge arose because the department who still see its function primarily as an income one, absorbed the National Employment Service from an agency that no longer exists. And when it was with FÁS, it was open to everybody working age. Now, it not maybe as fully as always as people would have liked, but it was. But when it got absorbed by the Department of Social Protection, particularly when the crisis hit, when this happened, then it came very focused in on a working age payment. And I still think that department, 10 years down the road, thinks income first, public employment services second. It's like a little add-on. And I think that needs to be addressed. Our public employment service and having a good, smart, well-informed, well-managed, well-resourced public employment service is going to be critical. We keep getting told by a range of international commentators that the world of work is changing dramatically, and the speed of that change is going to increase. And that the level of skills people will need over their lifetime are going to change, that we're heading for a fourth industrial revolution. Well, for most of us of working age to be able to manage that, we need a public employment service that can support and advise us, and that also has the wherewithal to say, we're not the right service for you right now, but the ETB down the road or whoever, they can now support you to make the decisions that you need to make to be able to get that job. And not only...
Reid, I'm so sorry. I know I'd say you could talk for an hour. You're so well versed in all of this, but just the time is going so quickly.
Okay, I'll just
I'm really sorry. It's a terrible position to be in, to have to stop you, because it is so interesting and you really know your stuff. But I'm just conscious of time, and Delma has to come in still. So just another minute. Is that okay? Sorry, Reid. I'm sorry to have to do that.
Okay, no worries. So in terms of just addressing that issue, in the Future Jobs Ireland, one of the jobs that the Public Employment Service, particularly Intro, was given was supporting people who are in work, who maybe are in work that is vulnerable to both the climate change that's coming at us and the changing world of work that's coming at us. And right now, I would question whether that service has the capacity to provide those supports. So we really do need to ensure that we are providing people with good income supports who need it. We need to ensure that we are providing people with a good public employment service that offers them guidance and advice. And if it cannot help them to the next stage, that it will then refer them on to those who are better placed to give people that support and guidance. Thank you.
Brilliant, Reid. Thanks so much, and I'm sorry again to have had to sort of urge you to finish up, but we'll go straight over to Delma, if you're there, Delma.
Yeah, I am.
Department of Sociology. Please go ahead, Delma.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, I don't want to stay long. I have very little to say, but my video won't come on for some reason. So, here you go. Great. Okay, everybody. So, first of all, I'd just like to congratulate Mary, Nuala and Michael for a fantastic conference, and to all the contributors. So I know I've seen the project playing out over the past 2 years, and I suppose the level of commitment, engagement, and the volume of output that they've produced from the research project really is incredibly high. So I'd just like to recognise all the effort and the hard work that they've put into the project to produce such high quality academic and practical practice orientated outputs. The same goes for the journal. So the special issue was really, really interesting. I had a look at, all of the papers, and, clearly both the results of the research and the results, emerging from the special issue indicate that, these are things that are highly relevant for both policy and practice. So I would hope that there's an opportunity or further opportunities, like Reid said, for all stakeholders to continue working together so that the research can feed into policy and practice. So the journal really shows that the forces that seek to pull public employment services in a particular direction, they seem to be putting too much pressure on the system, too much pressure on those working in the system, and too much pressure on those seeking support from it. So clearly there are things that can be learned from the research. So as practitioners, I guess, of any type, critical reflection on what we practice and how we practice it, and having the space to do that is really, really important, because we can all get dragged away in a particular direction. So what Dort and Fleming had to say about knowledge mobilization is highly relevant here, I would say. So while research may not have all the answers, it can definitely push us towards value creation of what public employment services can be. And the role of research in supporting people with jobs in the recovery from COVID-19 is highlighted in that OECD report that Mary mentioned earlier. So that's all I really wanted to add. It's Friday evening. People, I'm sure, are dying to go home. But really, many thanks for such a stimulating conference today.
Well, thank you, Delma, for adding to Reid's comments and the reflections on the piece. I know we're clean, absolutely clean out of time, so I just want to say thank you to everybody. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to chair the session, and thank you again to Michael and Mary for inviting me. So Mary, I'll hand over to you directly and see you soon.
Okay, I know we're totally out of time, and I would really like to thank everybody who has stayed with us. Over 100 people have stayed with us, so that's absolutely super. I think, like everybody, I really enjoyed today. I thought we were telling you everything that we knew, but actually I've learned a lot of new today, and some pennies have dropped, and it's been really super, and it's been a super 2 years of work, of collaboration, of co-production, and of a lot of people engaging with us in a really constructive and productive way. So I just really want to say thank you most sincerely to everybody, from our funders to the university, to the people I've worked most closely with, Nuala and Michael, to all of you out in the field who we have relied on as our sources of data, and particularly to the INOU, to the ILDN, and the local employment services who are on our immediate committee and worked very hard with us, but also to our national and our international committee. And I'm actually delighted that all of you on all our committees got to participate today in different roles as presenters and as chairpeople or respondents. And I think that's the spirit of collaboration that we have been working with for the last couple of years, and that I hope we continue with. So enjoy the weekend, enjoy our newfound freedoms, and hopefully we'll stay with this. Michael has put up the links on chat, but you can find us on the MUSSI website. We'll be on the INOU and the ILDN website as well. And please do use the toolkit, where we really hope it is useful and it has a life after our project. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a good weekend. Thank you. Bye.